Shall we begin? All right, I'll open with prayer. Let us pray. God, we thank you for the gift of this season, this Christmas season, and all that we remember. It's nice that it's 12 days so we can take in all the various parts of the story. We pray your blessing upon all of those who are sick, for your healing. And we give you thanks for this story that continues to unfold in our lives every day. Bless us in our hearing of it again. In Jesus' name, amen. So if you read, I know not everyone did, we're talking about Matthew and Luke's version of the Christmas story. And in both Matthew and Luke, they have extensive genealogies. They talk about the genealogy of Jesus, and it's to make a point, for sure. But particularly in Matthew's gospel, Matthew mentions several women in Jesus's genealogy. And I don't know if you remember reading that section, but Rahab, Tamar, who are not the matriarchs. But those of you who know who those women are, who were they, and what do you make of Matthew specifically mentioning them in Jesus's genealogy? Rahab, Ruth, and Tamar or Tamar?
I think Rahab is amazing because Rahab, and I guess the reason he chose Rahab because it was somebody who was invisible, and she protected. I think there were two visitors who came, and they were being chased by the other side, which I can't remember. It must be. I don't remember. It doesn't say. It was. And she took the two men into her house. She was a prostitute. So, but there was much more to her than prostitution. She saved them by bringing them into her home and then helping them go up the wall, over and out the other side where they could escape, which they did do. And she's mentioned because really she was not looking at who people were and what they could do for her, but rather what she could do for them. And it was saving their lives. And she's mentioned many other times in the Bible because of her deeds, her good deeds, really. And I know there's more written about it, and I'm not remembering because I didn't reread it, but that was, she's remarkable because for many people, she would just not be important, but we're just that she were a prostitute. But the fact that she could do more and thought more and made a difference to other people.
Can you spell her name?
Rahab, R-A-H-A-B, Rahab.
And why did she need to save them? What had they done that needed?
They were spies, and they had been found out, so they needed to escape.
Spies for
the Israelites what was it? Who were they
spying for?
Yeah, I mean they were spying for it, but who were they spying on?
Maybe the Amorites or one of the many tribes, right?
Yeah, I don't recall at the moment who they were spying on, but the fact that she was mentioned at all, she was a woman and she was a prostitute, and she's mentioned as in the genealogy of Jesus by Matthew. And Matthew also mentions Ruth, and Ruth was outside of the Israelite. She wasn't an Israelite.
It was a foreigner.
Yeah. And then Tamar, I'm forgetting Tamar's story.
Okay, so the Tamar that,
Two Tamars.
yeah, the one that is referenced here, I guess, was the one that had Judah's kid. So she was married to one of Judah's sons, and then he died, and she, as was the custom, was married to the next son, and something happened to him as well. And the youngest son, Judah didn't want her to marry the youngest son. And so she took it upon herself to get pregnant by Judah. She claimed to be a prostitute.
Hmm.
And then he had sex with her, and she, as payment, took his girdle and his something else, a belt or a ring or something that really would signify it was him. And so when he was really berating her for getting pregnant, she said, "Oh, by the way, it's yours." And then he recognized that that was righteousness, that she was right to do that, because apparently that was the thing, you had to keep the wife in the family. So
So yeah, it just is so significant that these women were mentioned and named, because they go through, they list, I don't know if you've read those parts of Matthew and Luke, but it's kind of the boring part, unless you know who these people are. And they're trying to build this genealogy of Jesus, in preparation for the birth of the king. And in their genealogy are these women. And so in a way, it seems to anticipate Mary and her situation. Born in pregnant without being married. So.
Do you think it also goes to really explaining the humanity of Jesus? While he is royal in David's line, he also is of a humbler, not so perfect lineage. And especially as we look at the women in that lineage.
yeah, I think you're right. And Amy Jill Levine was pointing that out too, saying that this was a way of kind of introducing the kingdom that belongs to everybody, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
being the one that is hierarchical.
Yeah. It's not Jewish, it's not masculine, it's
And it's not
feminine, gentle. Yeah.
Not-
For everyone. And really the best part in the book, if you have the book, it's pages 115, 16, 17 that talk about all of those. Again, this is all part of the genealogy, but it's to lead the way for Mary. It's to get you in the mindset that these things have gone on for years, that there have been unusual family relationships. People have done unusual things, yet they have been generous. They have been generous in some way. I certainly think of Ruth and Naomi. I mean, Ruth was just, the Ruth and Naomi relationship was really, to me, one of the most remarkable ones, where they stayed together at the most difficult time, when indeed they were from two different nations. But Ruth, who was the daughter-in-law, stayed with Naomi to make sure she would be all right. And so she gave up other things in her life, but she was true to family, even if it was through marriage. Different marriage.
Interesting genealogy, for sure.
Can
Well,
you tell me the name of the first lady again?
Tamar, is that who?
Not
Or
Tamar.
Rahab.
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 Rahab. Yeah. How about we watch the video?
Okay. Oh.
Cue it up.
Share some. You hearing anything over there?
No, it's very faint.
We're probably all familiar with
Oh.
We Three Kings of Orient, or which I used to think was Orient.
There we go.
We're probably all familiar with We Three Kings of Orient, or which I used to think was Orientar type of paving material. In any case, it turns out that the Magi, M-A-G-I, plural of the word magus, not necessarily three. We get three from the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but 3 or 4 people could have brought myrrh or frankincense. And we get kings from a misidentification of the Magi with some prophetic traditions. The Magi aren't kings. That would be counterintuitive for Matthew. It would be counterintuitive for Luke. Luke talks about kings being brought down. Matthew talks about the lords of the earth who lord it over us. Matthew doesn't like kings. Matthew likes people who establish a kingdom where everybody has equal rights and reigns together with God. The Magi are not necessarily three, they're not necessarily kings, and the idea of they're representing different parts of the world, it's a lovely story, but it's not the story Matthew tells. For Matthew, the Magi are simply Magi. They are Persian or Chaldean or Babylonian astrologers. Today, the word Magi is still being used. Magi today are Zoroastrian priests. And here we have a bit of a problem, because Matthew makes a little bit of fun of these Magi, and we should not be making fun of other people's religions. In terms of the Magi in Matthew, I like to refer to them as Larry, Moe, and Curly. There may not be 3 of them, but it seems to work. They are what we might call fools for Christ. They ask precisely the wrong questions, they act precisely the wrong way, and somehow it all works out to the good. According to the CEB, the story of the Magi begins like this. I'm in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea during the reign of King Herod, and remember that, King Herod, because kingship will be important, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem, and they asked, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east, or at its rising, and we come to honor him." Matthew stresses Herod, King of the Jews, and he repeats King of the Jews over and over again. When the Magi come to Jerusalem and ask, "Where is the King of the Jews?" that is the most impolitic, indeed dangerous, and perhaps silly question they could possibly ask, because Herod thinks he's King of the Jews, and he recognizes now there may be a challenge. So through the Magi's unwittingly silly, impolitic question, the plot begins. When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, as one might imagine, and everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. So Herod gathers the experts in the court and says, "Who's this newborn king and where is he supposed to be?" Herod is ostensibly king of the Jews, and he doesn't even know his own Jewish tradition. And the wise men in the court say, "Oh yeah, we know where this newborn king is supposed to be. According to the prophet Micah, the son of David, the Messiah, this newborn king, will be born in Bethlehem, the city of David." So the Magi now know where to go. Prophecy is being fulfilled. And as we see throughout the Christmas story in Matthew, as we already saw regarding the prediction of the virginal conception, pretty much everything in Matthew's nativity material is footnoted. Matthew is firmly anchoring his stories into the scriptures of Israel. Herod tells the Magi, "Listen, go find this king, and when you find him, come back and let me know." Completely disingenuous. If you think the Messiah is born, you don't wait for the Magi to come back. and the Magi, unaware that Herod actually has murderous intentions, had actually planned to do this. So the Magi pick up the star, which seems to be functioning like a GPS. That immediately tells us that the star is not what we would call a star. For Matthew, for people in the first century, stars were not enormous balls of hydrogen gas. Stars back then were understood to be the remains, the new bodies of righteous people who shine like the stars in heaven. A star is a sentient being, which is why you can follow it. And as we're told according to the Gospel of Matthew, when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. That's when the star stopped. The CEB is less clear than some other translations, which read something to the effect of, when the Magi saw that the star had stopped, they rejoiced with great joy. They remind me of the kids in the back seat saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" They're delightful, but the star drops them off by standing over the house. And so we know that the star is not a real star, because if a real star stops directly over your house, as it usually does in the Christmas cards, that house will be incinerated, as will the rest of the globe. In order fully to understand Matthew, we have to understand how people in the first century understood prophecy, understood stars, understood magi, and understood royal rule. When the Magi enter the house, they find the baby and Mary, his mother. I'd like the idea that perhaps Mary was nursing the child or maybe changing a diaper. This is a real baby. They drop off what we would today call the Christmas gifts, the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh. And people throughout history have come up with, what do these things symbolize? Gold because you need money, you've got a new child. Frankincense to make the room smell better. And myrrh sometimes I understood to deworm the child or some sort of health thing. But we just take them as gifts, and they're very high-end gifts. So the Magi drop off these gifts, and they're ready to go back to Herod, but typical for Matthew here, the Magi are warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, but to go somewhere else, not to tell Herod where the child has been born. And the Magi leave the text, and they wander out of the text, and I picture them still out there, perhaps following another star. I think Matthew's idea here is that these representatives of foreign knowledge, foreign wisdom, astrology back then was considered a science. Foreign wisdom, science can only get you so far. To get to the full meaning of the way the world functions, science is insufficient. You need revelation. When Herod realized he had been tricked by the Magi, and we don't know how long this took, 6 months, a year, 2 years, he becomes very nervous because he believes this prophecy of the newborn king. And he sends his soldiers to Bethlehem, and they kill all the children aged 2 years and younger. And there's a big difference between a 2-year-old and a newborn. Joseph had been warned in a dream to take the baby and flee to Egypt. Jesus survives when children around him are slaughtered. What would that have meant to him personally, knowing that other people died and he lived? What responsibility does he have? And then what responsibility do we who tell the story have? By setting Jesus in this context, Matthew is showing us that Jesus is like a new Moses. At the time of Moses' birth, Pharaoh in Egypt had ordered all the Hebrew babies thrown into the Nile, and Moses is the one who survives. Joseph and Mary take the child to Egypt, again echoing the story of Moses. And Matthew then brings in another fulfillment quotation, which is both profound and prescient. Matthew tells us that when all these children are killed, this fulfilled the words spoken through Jeremiah the prophet. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and much grieving. Rachel, weeping for her children, and she did not want to be comforted because they were no more. The quotation is from Jeremiah chapter 31, the New Covenant passage. It would have been well known to Jews at the time. It would have been well known to Jesus' followers. And I think Matthew was encouraging us, anytime there's a fulfillment quotation where we read, this was done to fulfill, or the prophet said, Matthew says, go back and look at the original text, because the prophecy is only half the story. If we go back and we look at Jeremiah chapter 31, again here from the CEB, After we read, because her children are no more, the very next verse in Jeremiah, the Lord proclaims, keep your voice from crying and your eyes from weeping, because your endurance, your steadfastness will be rewarded, declares the Lord. They will return from the land of their enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children will return home. Jeremiah is talking about the return of the Jews who had been exiled to Babylon in the 6th century. But for Matthew, perhaps, this image of the children coming home, these dead children, these martyred children, I think for Matthew that means resurrection. That the story is not over, that there is ongoing life and steadfastness, belief, earnestness, proclamation, all will be rewarded. The Christmas story is only the start of something more glorious and more wonderful and more profound. The more we hear it in a first century context, the more meaningful it becomes. Christmas story is just so full of wonderful material. But we've only looked at some of it. We talked about the Annunciation to Zechariah, his relationship with Elizabeth, the echoes of Old Testament scriptures. We talked about Mary giving birth. We talked about the angel. We talked about the trip from Nazareth because of the census. We talked about the Magi. We talked about the danger to the child's life. We talked about fulfillment of prophecy. We talked about stars and the census and the travel. And there's so much more. There's the rest of the story of John the Baptist. There are the genealogies which anchor Jesus to the scriptures and the people of Israel. There's the rest of the story of Joseph, indeed the story of Mary, who continues through the Gospels and then on into church history. These stories gave rise to other stories, and they also depend on stories of the Hebrew Scriptures. We start with the first 2 chapters of Matthew and Luke, but those chapters are embedded in a much larger story. And this tells us that Advent, that Christmas, is not all there is. One can't be a follower of Jesus and just do Christmas and Easter and forget everything in between. Fully to be a follower of Jesus, fully to understand this text, we need to go back to Genesis and go through the rest of the Gospels and go through the book of Acts and go through the rest of the New Testament. And as we do, we will find themes echoed over and over. Themes about compassion, themes about politics and economics, themes about relationship with outsiders, themes about family relationships and children and vulnerability, themes about seeing the world otherwise. The Christmas story is in fact one of the best Christmas gifts we could possibly have.
There's so much in that little bitty video. Each one of the videos that she recorded for this, you could 1,000 jumping off places. But I'm curious, what stood out to you in today's teaching and video?
How little I know. Being a cradle Catholic, that puts exclamation marks. You know, I mean, we heard the Gospels every Sunday, and I know how that travels through the year, but in depth.
Well, when you hear from a scholar, and she's a Jewish scholar, she's Jewish, has not converted to Christianity, but she talks about the Gospels with a kind of an evangelical tone, which Amy Agape referred to last session. One of the nuances that I learned is her talking about the Magi and how, from Matthew's perspective, according to her scholarship, they were holy fools for Christ. And because they asked in political questions to King Herod, like, where's the king of the Jews? That's not a question you would ask the king. And I had never thought of them in that way, as holy fools for Christ. They're astrologers from either Babylonia or Persia, but I don't know, did that strike you?
I love that view of them as being holy fools. It's just, it makes the story so much richer. I never did really know what to do with the Magi. Here they are, these foreign kings, and they come, descend, and then they leave again and never hear from them again. And it just seemed kind of incongruous. I know that the whole Feast of Epiphany is based on their visit, but it just wasn't anything I could ever make sense of, really. But to think of them as being holy fools, which in the tradition of fools, of holy fools, that's the person that comes into the situation as a catalyst. Just comes in and makes it happen, and then steps back or steps away. So to think of them that way is really very rich for me. And then Mo and Larry and Curly, that was even funnier. She said she got in trouble for saying that. Remember in the book, she says that she got in trouble for saying that on a talk show because the Zoroastrians still have magi as their priests. And so she thought that was quite droll that she, a Jewish scholar, got in trouble for maligning a different religion in a Christian setting.
So they were Zoroastrians then, do we know that?
We don't
No.
know if they were or not. Yeah, all that we know is that they were from somewhere in that region where the Zoroastrians started from.
So possibly Babylonia and what was the other?
Persia.
Persia.
Oh, Persia.
Or Mesopotamia, I think she said.
Did she say that too?
When they say astrologers, is that just when people go to the stars for signs, or is that like our modern day astrology with, or the 12? Do we?
I think it is like modern day astrology in the sense that they would look to the stars for portents of important things that were happening. And so, yeah, it would be very similar.
I have no idea the history of astrology. Is it like the same? Like there's Libras and Scorpios and that kind of thing?
I'm
Or
not
is it
sure,
just kind of
yeah,
a similar kind of thing, but possibly totally different.
possibly. I'm
Just
not sure
reading
where,
stars
yeah.
in some fashion.
She did talk about that a star is not necessarily
Right,
how
that
we
too,
think of
yeah.
a star today, because a star today is, if it were landing over a house, it would completely obliterate the house. But they were following something. They were following a sign. And so, I don't know, that got me curious about today and how we follow signs or stars. And how do we know something is a star, a sign from God, and not?
Yeah, that's a real good question to ponder, isn't it? Like, when is the portent a true sign, a true star in this way of thinking about it? Yeah.
Well, they were people who somehow got a sign to do this. And so where did that come?
Yeah.
And I like that they were outside of the tradition. I don't know, with Jesus coming to speak to all people, this is like a first sign that this newborn child, God incarnate, will go beyond the Israelites, the nation of Israel. And here's some foreshadowing to that effect.
Yeah, so Matthew, if you think about that, Matthew is proclaiming a kingdom that's not just not kings, but more common people, but also that crosses national boundaries and religious boundaries. And that I think is really interesting because more and more I'm drawn to thinking about the religious boundary we set up as Christians. You know, you have to follow Jesus. And that maybe that's not as important as we think. You know, that following Jesus in the way we think about it, as opposed to being people of love who can, like Amy Jill herself, you know, she talks about getting to heaven and Peter at the gates, and Peter basically says to her, oh, yeah, I mean, Jesus sticks his head out of the gates and says, oh, yeah, I know her, she can come in. You know, that kind of thing seems to be maybe where we're headed. I don't know, a little bit.
Some of us are headed that way. I wouldn't say all of us.
Well, that's true.
You know, signs are interesting because I think signs are about your spirituality. And so if, you know, you can see signs in daily life if your spirituality is there. You know, it's mystical.
It is, and I think, I don't know, we're gonna talk a little bit more about dreams coming up because Joseph had a dream, and I think of it like today, what do we follow? How do we discern God speaking to us through the signs? And are we paying attention? And what gets our attention? And do we believe that God does still speak to us in those ways? Like God spoke to Joseph and to the Magi and to Mary.
And if you think very concretely, you have, you know, it doesn't really work. But if you are coming from a more spiritual place, it works. You just take it in and you just go, thank you.
I think you're right, Claudia. It's like this seems to be an era of kind of commonplace mysticism, where mystics are no longer these, you know, put up high on the shelf and think of them as very special, but more an era where a lot of people experience that direct connection with God in a very everyday kind of way, in different ways, like you say. And so having that context for what you experience, for the book that falls off the shelf just when you need that particular book, or for somebody who says something to you and it strikes you as this is amplified by God, you know, and they said it, but the echo is somehow the voice of God, or yeah, whatever it is, the signs that we see that influence our hearts like that. It seems like those are increasingly known these days, increasingly.
And I think there's been a lot written and said about more than just our basic senses. There are people that are very in tune to other senses. And, you know, like you get this little mental message, I need to call Mary. And you're like, no, I got to clean the house. Claudia, stop it. Get the house clean, blah, blah, blah. You push it off. Call Mary. Comes back. And you're like, okay, twice. That's it. Call Mary. And she's in some crisis. What is that about? But I follow it. I mean, I just, when I get the message, I'm like, got it. And I just call. I don't ask any questions. I just do it.
So how about the rest of you? Have you had those sorts of experiences of, you know, that kind of message, call somebody or pay attention to such and such? Yeah.
I get too excited about it and then you know, when it's involving somebody else who's just not gonna be on board, and you're like, oh, I was just thinking, you know, this and that. And you just get all like crazy about it, you're like, okay. But sometimes it's just hard not to, you know, notice those things. Although I think you can get, like, when I was in high school, like, I got kind of obsessive about coincidences, and then they start conflicting with each other, and then you can start seeing too many patterns, too many things, but it's but you learn, I think, to be discerning, I guess, balance, and
Yeah, the desert mothers and fathers of Egypt in the 5th century talked about that. You have to be part of a community if you are listening to those sorts of voices, you know. They talk about the brother who heard that he should jump in the well and jumped in the well and died because he wasn't listening to the community. He was just going with the voice itself. So there's that kind of balance that needs to happen. But, you know, yeah, I think that you're learning how to discern with your gift, you know, and what makes sense and what doesn't, which is really cool. Yeah.
I appreciate you mentioning community and discerning signs, because that's one thing my spiritual director does for me, is she'll say, well, what do you bring to our time together? And often I will bring something that happened that was disturbing, or something that I keep going back to. It keeps coming up for me. And then she will help in this community, Christian community, decipher and discern and pick out. And then it's like all of a sudden it dawns on me that God is speaking to me through this experience that continues to come forward and helps tease apart what God might be saying.
In
Yeah.
that Emmanuel moment.
The
Yeah.
Emmanuel moment.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's a segue for dreams. You want to move there, or do you have other
Go ahead.
material?
I love to hear you talk about dreams.
Okay. So yeah, one of the really neat ways that we can be in touch with God's voice is through our dreams. And it's the same thing though. You need community in order to help interpret it, because a lot of times you'll have a dream that seems on surface just devastating, you know, like I remember one in particular Roseanne had years ago, and she woke up in the morning and she was like, Lori, I just had this terrible dream that I put a child inside a kiln and baked it. And I said, well, it's not so terrible. What do you mean that's not so terrible? Well, if you look at it symbolically, the kiln is a place of regeneration and new beginnings, and the fire of making something new and holy. And so her inner child was in this transition place and moving into a whole new understanding of her life. And it was a trial by fire, because she was going through a lot of stuff with people who were harming her. And so it was like being in the kiln. It was like being in that intense heat that forms you. So those sorts of things. So Joseph's dreams, though, seem pretty straightforward, don't they? God says, do this, and Joseph does, or go there, and Joseph does. And so that kind of dream is also very present and very powerful. Have any of you guys had that kind of a dream? Sort of a voice from the great collective saying, do this or do that? And,
Yes, but I don't know whose voice it is.
mhm.
You know, and sometimes I do, but, and like my mother, she talks to me. But I've nothing that I could identify as God. But that's okay. She's up there with him, so.
You think about the dream maker as being God, and that kind of gives a good reference for you. So your mother, your mother could be your actual mother. Your mother could be the inner mother, the mother that's part of your own soul,
Right,
or your mother could be the feminine side of God,
right.
and all of the above. And
Mhm.
yeah, so listening to those voices. Uh,
I don't actually remember my dreams. I will know I have dreamed, dreamt, but to identify specifics, I don't have that capability apparently.
Well, it takes a practice, and if you're interested, I mean, a lot of people, that's not their way of apprehending the holy. But if you're interested, there are ways of learning to be more present to your dreams, you know, like telling yourself, having an intention at bedtime that you're gonna remember your dream, and having a little notebook that you put out.
You can train yourself. It's amazing. You wouldn't think you could, but I took a class in dream therapy. It was part of an art therapy group.
Nice. What a good combo.
We had to, it was a university course. And we had Jungian based, and we had to present a picture. It was summer school, so we were there every day at this class. And we had to present a picture, a literal artistic picture. But I'll tell you what, when you start drawing it out, and you could train yourself. Because I didn't.
I want to.
It's fascinating.
I just love how scripture elevates dreams as being a way that God speaks to us, because I grew up and that was just considered hogwash. To be honest, that's the tradition I grew up in. But as I began to read the scriptures and know how many times God had spoken to people in the Bible about what God was trying to do, then I began to elevate that way of God communicating to us through dreams. And I had a dream that was really powerful for me right before going to seminary, where I was on the altar and the priest that I knew as Mother Connie was giving me a facelift on the altar. So there was a lot there.
Yeah.
As I was thinking about and moving towards becoming a priest myself. What's that? Gonna multitask?
You gotta multitask.
I didn't get that message. But that's
Totally
good.
good.
I had though, Kathleen, I had one person in a dream group that I was running years ago who just had the hardest time, couldn't remember her dreams, and was so frustrated. And the second to the last class that we had, she came in and she said to the group, I remember a dream. I said, great, tell us, what was your dream? And she said, Lori, you and I were walking through this foggy landscape looking for a dream. That was her dream.
I have one great dream that reoccurs, and that dream I remember because it's frightening. It's a frightening. And I'll go years without having it, and then all of a sudden it will reoccur.
Does it change at all in detail?
The details may change. I'm running away. I'm escaping from something, and I never know what that is. I never know. And I may be running in hallways. It's always like a maze. And I'm might be tall buildings, might be alleyways, might be ditch banks, all different environments, but always the same. And I wake up before anyone catches me or before I get away. I never get away.
You wake up.
I wake up before.
Are you always enclosed?
It's always enclosed. I
Yeah.
always have sides and narrow. It's always narrow.
Yeah.
And no one is around. I'm all by myself, always alone, and I'm always running. I don't run as hard as I used to. I guess. No, but,
Yeah, well, that's a really common dream to have, you know,
escaping from something.
running, yeah, escaping from something. Usually it's something that you could turn and face and learn a lot from. And so,
I would like to know,
yeah.
since it's reoccurring
Mm-hmm.
and somehow it hasn't apparently been solved. And I'm 80 years old and I'd like to solve that issue.
Well,
Or maybe I'm running to something that I'm afraid of. I mean, I could be. I don't know I don't know.
right.
It's just that I'm running. And I'm not.
It seems to me that in a case like that, or things that have happened to me, is to pray to God to show me the meaning.
You say pray.
Pray
to
Try to
God.
show the meaning, yeah.
Pray to find the meaning.
Yeah.
And you could take a page from Claudia's book and do a picture of it. Just
It's amazing.
fill it.
Just, and it doesn't have to be pretty. I can just close your eyes and go, oh yeah, I remember, yeah, there's this big thing and there's this big thing. And I did use watercolor because they were pretty colorful. And I kept them. Yeah, and then we had to write about it. It's amazing what you learn. And it comes, and when we talked about them in class, we shared it. And bingo. Just tells you a lot, tells you.
Yeah, I think the dreams in scripture, they already come interpreted pretty much.
Who knows that if Joseph, what he actually dreamed,
Right, yeah.
but he got the message that he was to take Mary as his wife and
Right.
not do away with her. He got that message, and he got the message that he was to take Jesus and Mary out of the country because their lives were in danger.
Mhm.
But who knows how that dream came to him originally?
Yeah, good point. That's a really good point. Yeah. And he had the gift of being able to interpret. Yeah. The first Joseph also did, but with those dreams, they weren't Joseph's dreams, they were the Pharaoh's dreams,
He was
right?
interpreting.
And he was interpreting. And so the Pharaoh wasn't having much luck with interpretations with his wise people, and Joseph said, oh, well, here's what this means. And it proved to be the case, proved to be a good interpreter. So that's the other thing. That's part of our tradition.
Daniel's dreams.
And Daniel's dreams, yeah, same thing.
I'm left with images often when I've had a dream that I have to remember. And actually, Lori did a dream class, which I attended a couple of years ago, and we all had to create what our image was. And I think I did paper, and maybe we were supposed to do a collage. I can't remember. But I did my grandfather's house with no ceiling and just people working inside. And what I could see, what the outside was obviously trees and sky. So that was fun to interpret because, again, my love of nature, of being outdoors, of that awesome world that we actually can see if we take the time to appreciate it and realize it is a sign to us also. That was fun. But my current image I'm working on is the lamb. The lamb was just there one night as it was getting towards morning, and it was just looking straight at me and with no facial expression, but just was there. So I'm working on this because clearly there is something in that I need to think about and pray about to figure out what that means for me. But it was extraordinary because it was such a very clear image of not just one lamb out in the field, but it was a more developed lamb. So it had more interesting things, which would be, if I were artistic, I'd love to be able to duplicate it because it was beautiful. It was striking. It had meaning. So,
And he was looking at you.
yes.
Does he come often?
No, but it has stuck with me.
Okay.
So I've gone back to it a number of times and again, because I took time to sort of focus in on that, and I've done that with a number of dreams. There's one image that's left that I can go back and think about.
Oh, that's a real rich one, really rich. Lots of scriptural references. Okay, thanks. So we actually have talked more about the Joseph dream, which was the other thing I was going to mention. Kind of done that. So it kind of does bring up, though, thinking about Joseph and his dream. What kind of guy is he? What's his, who is he? What do you make of this character, Joseph, in Matthew's gospel? He's a carpenter, but I think of woodworker when I think of carpenter, and Amy Jill Levine is saying probably not, probably more like a contractor, a house builder, or somebody like that. So, yeah. So what does that tell you about him, Pete?
Well, first of all, he worked with his hands. And his thought process probably was focused on hands-on kinds of things, how to do it, depending on what his skill level. And that takes a certain kind of mind to be able to visualize what something's going to look like. But that's a very hands-on.
And yet, like you say, it's got the aspect of being able to visualize is part of it.
Yeah.
Be able to see something in its finished form when you haven't even started to work on it yet.
Yeah, but it also, when you have that mindset, you look at everything, and I have to just say that because I used to, when I was working, I had a period of time when I had dreamed of the house that I grew up in northern Delaware. It was an old 1900 house with a dirt floor basement. And I visualized, okay, if I go down and turn the corner this way, I'm getting into a huge room. Now, how all that relates to the house, I don't know. But it was just using imagination and how that goes together and what's in that huge basement.
Yeah.
And just exploring that. So sometimes the dreams that I have are related to all that hands-on stuff. I don't have other kinds of dreams. The only other thing that I've had 2 out-of-body experiences a long time ago. One was actually at a vestry. And the first one I had was in college, and I got sent to the dean of students by a professor, idiot, but I was sitting there listening to the dean, who I didn't appreciate, I just felt
Wow.
up here someplace, totally out of my body. It was like, this is the ultimate ridiculousness. So I can't explain them,
Mhm.
but both instances were rather ridiculous. So anyhow.
Yeah.
I was intrigued by your comment about imagination, that even someone that's hands-on, like Joseph as a carpenter, you have to have the capacity to imagine something, and I think you hinted to that too. And I did a little bit of it thinking about Mary and her capacity to imagine. And I don't know, I've just been intrigued with that being a part of our faith journey, is our imagination. To be able to see the world from a faith perspective, from a perspective of God being a part of everything. And that requires a certain kind of imagination.
Mm.
And excuse me.
It gets into seeing how the world is,
Mm.
and I guess having the faith that in spite of the difficulties that we live in currently, you can see ahead and say, yeah, things are going to change, and sometimes for the better. But, if you go back and look at different time periods, we've always had issues,
Absolutely.
and some of them very difficult, much more than right now.
Civil War.
Well, yeah, that's the biggest one.
And, we've had, it's not historically different.
No, but if you do reading about the American Revolution,
I like that idea of Joseph being one who can perceive those things. That really fills him out for me. I like that. Thank you for sharing, because that's neat to think of him that way. And he'd have to be. I mean, he, takes his wife and maybe his gold and goes to Egypt, yeah, he took off to whole different land, and who knows? Yeah.
he had to go on a lot of faith.
And then his brothers came back into Egypt.
Oh,
you're
that
talking about
Joseph,
Joseph,
yeah.
Yes, and that, golly, they had to figure it out.
Mhm.
That they did something very bad.
There's an interesting article in a paper yesterday about how we need to turn Christmas back to the medieval times, because during the medieval times, Advent was a very serious time of true prayer, of thinking and reflecting back and change, preparing truly for the Christ. So, and then on Christmas, of course, then the arrival of Christ. Today, they pointed out, you prepare by shopping, by not going to church because we're so busy doing other things. And then then Christmas comes, and then, it's over. And so really our whole emphasis is not as it was in medieval times, and that really Advent, which I think we've tried to address here by having readings and so on, is a very special time for to be looking for the light and doing that in all kinds of different ways and different ways of interpreting the ways you do that. And then really Christmas is when the package is open, the light is suddenly revealed. And then you enjoy that for a period after. There is that lingering, wonderful feeling of knowing the Christ, of seeing the light, of changing from in various ways that were predicted or that you came up with as you're in your thinking and praying during Advent. So there really is a progression. And then it's this party, this fireworks going off. You know, it's beautiful and it hangs with you for a period of time. And that's not the way things are now, because I don't really like this for Christmas. I'm going to return it, you know, and so on and so forth. And just just going right on over it and not appreciating the deep meanings. And you know, what's been wonderful about this is her tying and laying on top of layers all the different books of the Bible and people and prophets and things they have said and predicted. And that's what I love about this. It's just, instead of each one being a little compartment, there is that wonderful tying through, like you're doing a material, like, you know, you're weaving. I'd like to think of this time passing after Christmas as being a time of sort of savoring these wonderful things we've been doing, and maybe, you know, picking up on your idea of the dreams and artwork and things like that. You know, I just, you know, we can do that, but which the world may not. Even part of Fort Collins may not, but it would be lovely to do that, and as we've tried to do this Advent and Christmas season.
Yay, love that. Thank you. Yeah.
Everybody talks about how awful it is to age. And I think age is just glorious, because age has given me those opportunities which young mothers do not have and working women do not have. You know, they have to, the minute those boxes are open, they have to hit the road running because they've got to go to work on Monday morning. And they're trying to get their house put back together and the food, you know, blah, blah, blah. And aging is beautiful. I mean, there's so much that is, you can do.
Yeah. You can rest in that rich space that you're talking about, Terry. Yeah.
You can feel the joy,
Feel the joy. Feel
be
the,
grateful.
yeah. Okay, well, we're kind of at the end, so any other final thoughts?
One thing that struck me in the story was I have never thought about how Jesus must have felt knowing that people died because he was born.
Yeah, wasn't that an interesting?
That I had never thought about that,
Yeah.
but that had to weigh very heavy.
Yeah.
How you would feel if you felt that.
That made me think of my own survivor guilt, which isn't, I mean, I don't have any direct catastrophes that I can, you know, that I can look at, but I sure do have lots of images from TV articles and, you know, images of people dying and people getting blown up and all of that stuff. I mean, so I do have some survivor guilt just from that.
Yeah, survivor guilt.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you saw the priest that gave the sermon Christ in the Rebel in Bethlehem Lutheran, in actual Bethlehem. And they also had a service of the Holy Innocents, which is the slaughter of the children, commemorating that. And what they had spread out in front of the altar were a heart for every child that had been killed in Gaza.
Wow.
And talk about survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I live in a country where I don't have to worry about bombs falling upon me. And yet their lives were taken.
I don't know if this is appropriate, but my mother used to always say, you know, there's a lot of things in life worse than death. But it was peaceful to me. I mean, living can be challenging.
Oh, no kidding.
And those children, you know, those families have so many, they don't have homes, they won't have for a long time. I mean, it's just what those mothers and children and husbands are gonna have to go through to try to get any sense of normalcy is just overwhelming. So I think my mother said that for peace of mind. I don't know.
I think what it does for me is challenge me to do something besides get overwhelmed. Just the way that Amy Jill put it makes me think, what is it that I can contribute out of the generous place that I'm in to the world? You know, what is it that I can give that's my own to give, and that is the result of surviving, basically. You know, thinking about both Christ and Moses as being survivors, and that, you know, they lived into their calling after that. So what's mine? You know, what is each one of ours, and how do we do that? Yeah.
May I add something?
Sure.
Amy Jill, on the penultimate page, talks about survivor guilt and what can be done. And her response is, by acting in their name with kindness and compassion, we honor their memories. It's in the middle of page 138. And that is how she concludes that whole story of Jeremiah and bringing the fulfillment of the resurrection story as a part of the Advent story, which I hadn't connected before this, but by acting in their name.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, y'all. Thank you so much for this study. It's been wonderful. Let's end in prayer. Beloved, you've given us tons of stories that are meant to lead us into deeper understanding of who you are. And you work with each of us in our unique beings as who we are, to guide us, to lead us, to help us to see our particular gift in the world. Thank you for all the ways that the stories speak to us. Thank you for Amy Jill Levine and her unique perspective. Thank you for each of the people that has met with us during the course of this study, and how we each inform one another in ways that help us all to grow deeper in knowledge and love of you. And bless us as we go forth into the new year. Give us what we need and help us to be open to what you would have us do. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.